Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path. And what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. Have you ever worried that if you were to truly shine as bright as you could, you'd make others uncomfortable? Or have you noticed moments where you shut down your own potential or thriving? You even may just believe that your needs, your emotions, or your presence is simply too much for people. The fear of being too much can be a very common one, especially in empathic circles, and can create patterns of inhibition that keep us settling for less than. We've experienced this fear in our lives in our own ways, and that's why in this episode, we're speaking all about it. If you're enjoying the show, there are a few ways we would love your help to support us. We would so appreciate it if you'd leave a review on iTunes. Thanks to all of you who have. This helps more people find the show, and it just feels great to us. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to receive our weekly digest or find out more about becoming one of our precious supporting members on Patreon. For the moment, we've chosen not to have advertisers on the show, so becoming a patron is the way to help us provide these episodes that we hope uplift your world. Brooke and I also see clients privately, so feel free to go to the website for more information on that. One last thing before we head into conversation, just in case you're new, Brooke and I have been known to curse from time to time, so if you're in mixed, non-swearing company, you may want to wear some headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go. Brooke.
Hey, Vanessa.
Did you have a nice Mother's Day yesterday?
I worked, but we celebrated on Saturday, so it was good.
Oh, how was that? Happy Mother's Day.
Why, thank you. Thank you.
I feel personally responsible for the fact that we don't talk about parenthood or mothering more on the show, and all of you should know this. I take full accountability, but because sometimes we get questions about that. But the reason why we don't, in case any of you were curious, is because I am not a parent, and I hate to talk about things I don't have experience on, lest I sound like that person.
Right, which there's a lot of that person in the parenting world. But if you're just present with them, it just all smooths itself out. Not my experience, yeah.
But I have so much honoring of all you parents out there, and a happy belated Mother's Day to each and every one of you. So today we're going to talk about something that I'm sure we've spoken about in other episodes, but it felt like it was time to give it its own container. Mm. And this is something that personally I've dealt with a lot in my life. But I suppose it's like other fears. You don't realize how common it is until you start to listen to people. So when we're in our own fear or our own conditioning, we're like, oh, I have this fear, but no one has this fear. That even my fear is abnormal. And in sitting and listening to people, working with people for so long, I started to realize, actually, this is not an uncommon experience. So today we're going to speak about the fear of being too much for people. And perhaps interwoven in that, we will also get to the conversation of the fear of not being enough. But I'm beginning with the fear of being too much because I think it's just spoken about a little bit less. I think especially if you've been in psycho-spiritual circles for a while, you've probably heard someone talk about a lack of worth, right? Feeling unworthy, thinking you're not good enough. That's pretty common parlance in our psycho-spiritual communities. But a little less so do people speak about the fear of being too much. So let's get into that today. What do you think?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Let's do it. Well, this was in part brought on by a beautiful client of mine who, as we were sitting together, discovered that it felt scary to step into their fullness, to step into their wholeness, to be as shiny and bright as their soul may want to be. And it was a reminder to me of a time in my life when I also felt that way. We could be afraid of stepping into ourselves for a lot of reasons, right? Like we could not want to be seen because being seen could be perceived as dangerous by our bodies based on our past experiences. So there are a lot of reasons that this can come to the foreground. But one of the things I dealt with in my life was I always thought I was too much for people. And it was, I guess the way all fears are, overly vague. Like I'm too happy, I'm too sad, I'm too laughy, I'm too loud, I'm too annoying, I'm too needy, I'm too, so it had this like very broad category of the ways in which I could be too much. But I suppose where it gets even really tricky, and I wonder if you've ever had this, Brooke, but is where you feel like even your goodness can be too much, like even your fullness can be too much, that if you were just yourself, that somehow it could be threatening or it could attract painful attention. Mm-hmm. Have you ever had that?
Yeah. I mean, I have it, like you were saying, I think there's probably lots of different flavors of this. And I for sure have that in a don't shine, don't take up too much space, and not safe. Like it's not safe to thrive, I would say. That the like embodied experience of thriving and what it would mean to take up that amount of space, like for those listening, if you can just drop in the inquiry of like, what does it feel like in my body? The word thrive, that feels really historically very threatening to me. And that's been a big part of my path, is having the experience of thrive, which to me instantly feels like this kind of big fullness in myself and in taking up space in the world. And then it hits a nerve of too vulnerable, too exposed, and all the seeking signals of safety stuff comes on board, right? And I think one of the ways to maintain safety is get smaller. That's the habit.
Can we slow that down a little bit? Like, do you mind if we like dig into it a little? Okay, so I think it's easy for a lot of people who've had a rupture in trust to understand the idea that if I'm seen, I may attract unwanted or painful attention, either from a predator or from even just peers that could then attack you. You think too well of yourself, etc. So I think it's easy to relate to the idea that being seen, being very visible, taking up space can be threatening. But thriving is a very specific word. So is it like if I was to thrive, I would be so radiant that I'd be more likely to be seen? Or how would you describe why thriving would carry that threat signal?
God, well, I could probably endlessly psychoanalyze myself on the show. I'm not sure how useful that is, because I can see, of course, the way it's related to, say, historical things.
Sure.
Growing up middle class in an area where that was comparatively like wealthy, having a 2-car garage and money to go to college where I grew up was like, I felt like the bad one. Like I had a certain kind of survivor guilt, that I had things that a lot of the people who I went to school with didn't have, grew up in a, for the most part, pretty working class area of Massachusetts, except for like my neighborhood. So it felt like that thing, right? Of the visible ones, the ones with the bigger houses, the ones, and even as I'm saying this, it's really funny. I can hear my mind wants to come in and say something along the lines of, but explain to everyone listening, Brooke, that it was really just solid, basic middle class. Like your parents had just enough for retirement, college, and like a 2-car garage, but it wasn't fancy, which is just funny even to observe the habit, right? Of like, make sure it's not seen as too much, too bright and shiny. So that's one aspect. And of course I can see plenty of other things too, but it's literally, and then there's personality stuff too, right? Don't be too, all the ways that we get policed by our social peers. Don't be too cheerful. Don't be too smart. Don't be too interested and engaged. It's really amazing, actually, how much cultural policing there is around don't be the one that's thriving, which must be related to, I'm curious what you think about this, but it must be related to a certain kind of survival instinct, because if we think about it logically, the ones who thrive, right? Whatever the many things that word can mean, the healthy ones, the accomplished ones, the ones that have the money to go to college, the funny, engaging ones who do great on interviews and tests, right? Like, let's make it really basic stuff that we would imagine culturally would consider thriving. If you logically think about it, it's like, if this is a survival of the fittest culture, everyone would be wanting to demonstrate those things as loudly and as readily as possible. And for sure, we see people wearing that Halloween costume. We see people wearing the dog eat dog, I'm going to climb the ladder fastest costume. So I'm not saying that doesn't exist. But what is it when that gets contorted so that is the threatening thing to do or to be? I don't know. Is it just those of us who got more threats from peers or our cultural environment, like the smaller culture?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Now that you explained to me what you meant by thriving, I completely relate to it. It's just not a word I use a lot, so it helped me to hear how you were breaking that down. Because I think of it similarly. For example, growing up, I happened to get, because I was the youngest, my parents had more resources as I was getting older. Resources meaning time, energy, and money, because I was quite a bit younger than my sisters. And so sometimes they would say I was the golden child, which when someone says that to you, it's interesting. I think empathic people look for dissonance a lot as a cue of danger. So I'm like, you're saying nice words, only it feels like you don't like it.
Right. It's not like, thank you, I am the golden child.
I am. Wow, how wonderful. Indeed.
Doesn't seem like the response you're going for me. It seems like you're trying to evoke shame.
Oh, the special one. Oh, the golden child. Oh, Vanessa. And I'm like, okay. Nice words, very angry messaging underneath the words. And I've noticed about myself that dissonance is a real problem for orienting to safety. And I'm imagining that's true for most people, whether they're aware of it or not. But if your words and your energy don't match, I'm going to cue that. If I notice with people with Botox, if they aren't displaying an actual genuine smile because those muscles are paralyzed, I'm flagging it as they're saying they're happy, but they don't look happy, right? Dissonance in general is a problem for me. So you get a lot of that cultural messaging. Oh, you're so lucky. You're so skinny, which P.S. no one ever said that to me, but I had a dear friend that people were saying that to. You're so skinny. Well, is that good or bad? Right? Like, because you're not saying it like it's good. So I do think in part we are on the other side of some fear of lack and some jealousy and envy that can arise when people perceive there are limited resources.
Yeah.
So for example, in the case of my sisters, for some reason I was getting more time, money, and energy. It was perceived that they were lacking in those resources. And that's where that sense of competitiveness, I'm not saying my sisters were competitive with me, but that you were talking about earlier, Brooke, fight, flight, freeze might come in. Men, women, if you're attractive to the opposite sex, that or same sex, if that's your preference, then that can start to come in, right? Because I had this a ton in high school. There was a perceived limited resource. Only this many people I find attractive, and they like you. Now I'm mad at you for being attractive. So I think it is common in our society, as you said, because envy is common, lack is common, jealousy is common, judgment is common.
Everyone thinks they're separate, so they're on their own. They're going to have to go get anything that happens in their life. They, the separate self, has to go get it through effort and competition from the other people who might get it. Yeah.
Right. And then if you're a sensitive soul and you have the type of what seems like empathic wiring that tends towards a codependent expression of relationship, if you're that kind of person, I think it becomes very important to feel like you fit in. And I think part of how the empathic person perceives fitting in is that no one's threatened of them.
Yeah.
Right? That they're not hurting people. They're not creating distress. Like, the last thing a really empathic person wants is someone to feel bad because of who they are or because they seemingly have more than them. You know, I don't want you to feel bad because I'm an extrovert and you're introverted. So let me tamp it down and be, less engaging with people so you don't feel bad or threatened. I think it's like that part of the brain that says, it's safer to fit in, and that's just the limbic brain. We all have that since we're a species of co-creation and cooperation. And then how do I fit in? Well, I'm aware of people's feelings, and I know if they feel bad about who I am or they're threatened by what I have, it seems advisable to just tamp it all down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can see how too much and not enough, like you're pointing out here, if it's all about make sure I'm acceptable to the others by scanning for how am I being perceived, what's going on with them, do I represent any kind of threat, we can see how too much and not enough are one thing. It's like a circular shape or like one continuum where in some instances, if you're picking up cues from the others that you're too much, you're going to dim yourself, make yourself smaller, make yourself seem less threatening to the others. And if you're picking up on cues from the others that they are wanting and needing something from you, then you're going to then try and pour yourself out more to them. Be the more polite one, the more thoughtful one, the more engaging one. And so it just sets up where it's always about, the curse of the empath, right? Like I can read the cues and I'm only going to exist within what I can feel in other people is perceived as non-threatening and acceptable. So it's this constant, putting ourselves into a pretty small box of, I'm going to only be out there scanning. How's it going? How am I perceived? And then what do I need to do so that they feel okay about my existence?
So that then I can feel okay about my existence.
So that I can finally have permission to exist at all. Mm-hmm. Not as I am in my full personhood, but at all. Because we're willing to play the role. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll play the role. I just want to be able to take a deep exhale and not have to manage the whole thing so deeply. I just want to know what you think is good. And then I'll do that. and then I can feel good and
relax.
Then
I can chill out because I'll feel that you chilled out. Just a little breather before the next person I need to manage and monitor and behave a certain way for.
Mercy to the humans, right? Mercy to the humans. It is an interesting thing too, because of course, like with anything, you'll have this fear, I'm too much, or you'll have this fear, I will be too much if I was to let myself thrive or shine. And then of course, you fill in the blank, and that would be threatening somehow to either others or me or both, right? Mm-hmm. So we walk around with this fear. And then as life would have it, we see it come back to us in the mirror of our world. And so we always find someone who is willing to say, you either are too much or you do have too much. Mm-hmm. And it's not fair, or I hate you, or I don't like it, or you're bothering me, So I remember when I was in grad school, part of my training in psychology was that we had to do group therapy. So I would do group therapy, and it was very much a process group. That's the kind of therapy I did. It was called T group. And so in this group process, people would tell you how they felt about you or around you oftentimes.
Sounds like a hell realm.
Oh, Brooke. It was simultaneously one of the more helpful things I've done in my life, like something that like rocket fueled me through some of my painful patterns, and the thing I dreaded literally the most. It was just, for my ego system, torture to show up every week and sit in this group where everybody was reflecting and projecting their childhood wounding with full permission for just hours and onto you. So I would go to the group, and as somebody with, especially at that time, this is years ago now, I was emotionally disconnected for a larger part. I couldn't name emotions. Like I would know I had a feeling in my stomach, like someone kicked me in the gut when you said something, but I couldn't call that shame or guilt or anger. So that's how new that wiring to my emotional body was. And I had conflict avoidance, and I had essentially what could just be boiled down to a fear of people. Mm-hmm. I just did not feel that safe around people. I liked people, so I liked to be around them, and at the same time was afraid of them. So going to this group where people had permission to just say whatever they wanted to me.
It's like empath prison, torture prison.
It was like so terrible. And as you can imagine, what I had heard on multiple occasions was, Vanessa, you take up too much space. It feels like there's no space for me in the room. Okay. Now, the funny part of that, the funny haha part of that was that because of all those reasons I just described, when I went to those groups, I was zip it quiet. My whole strategy, as my strategy has always been for life and conflict, was like, just hide, like stay super quiet and try not to move, and nobody will notice you, and then nobody will talk to you. So it was this really weird, ironic thing where I was sitting there absolutely as quiet as I could be, not engaging. I used to even need to have like little talismans in my hand. They had these little like kind of toys, and I would just hold on to them like little Buddha dolls, like, and here I am. And multiple people over and over again are like, you take up too much space. And I could not wrap my head around what was happening, because here I am trying to hide. And here, like, what do you think of that? I mean, what do you like? Pretend it's not me, but just what could you imagine could be happening where someone's desperately trying to take up zero space and over again keeps hearing you take up too much space?
I have no idea with the way that you're describing it, but knowing you and knowing your grad school experience, like I imagine that they were taking from seeing you in other spaces, right? Because you arrive Bay Area, master's in psychotherapy or whatever it was actually officially called, from New York, right? Like you're like Vanessa from New York. Yeah. And you are like, you're vivacious and bubbly and warm, and you're like, hey. And, so my thought is that they were probably pulling from seeing you, which of course, San Francisco therapy master's program has got to have a high level of people who have a suffering bypass tendency, the unworthiness stuff, identities around I'm the traumatized one. And for those of you who are listening who are like, fuck you, Brooke, I am all of those things. I can identify them because it is the story my identity tells about me, for sure. So I know that flavor really well, inside and out. And then along comes like, hey, vivacious Vanessa, moved here from Brooklyn. That if you're not playing that role in the room, it would still feel like a chance where you're in a corner and it's like, get her, right?
We can finally talk about this.
The unworthy egos are like, God, I'm just going to like take her down to size, get her to like be a real person, wring some tears out of her. Tears are what's supposed to be happening all the time here.
Oh my gosh, people were dying.
I want to hear about her shame patterns. Let's really push those to the surface.
And of course, it's an opportunity for everyone to bring forward what was subconscious so they can heal. The idea being relationship is a perfect place to project all of your unmet wounds, right?
I haven't noticed that. That's interesting. That's a good pro tip.
Isn't it weird? So, of course, they knew that if you're in a group of people, it's obvious we're going to be throwing our unmet wounds into the ring, right? Like consciously, unconsciously, so we can work it out. So here's a funny thing. I never thought of that angle, Brooke.
I think they were glimpsing you in other social situations. And they were like, finally, cage death match with the extrovert from Brooklyn.
Because these interns weren't always in your classes. So that was what was interesting. These were people who, like, you just met in the circle, but they saw me working at the clinic at different moments. I have like a really concrete theory, but here's another exploration I have. I wonder about people and their energy bodies. I mean, we're only looking at the 3D realm. So from the 3D realm, I'm saying I'm sitting still and I'm not talking. How could I be taking up space, right? And that's only looking at materiality. Well, what's happening on an energy level? Could I have been merging into the field of the room with my big energy body, as was my tendency to feel safe?
And especially in order to pre-perceive threat. And you're in a threat situation. So, of course, you would be extra spidey senses scanning.
Right. And so then that's interesting because here I am on a conscious level trying to take up zero space, but might it have felt different on an energetic level as I was innocently merging into the field and perhaps touching other people's experience without maybe even being consciously aware of it. Mm-hmm. So then we have that factored into how people feel us. On the most basic level, I think it's a mirror of life kind of situation. Like what I needed to heal was this idea that if I was to exist, it would be too much for people. Mm-hmm. I certainly have felt not enough in my life and too much at the same time, as you described, Brooke, like almost like trying to toggle this very subtle reality where you're like enough to make people like you, but not so much that they feel threatened or that they get angry or don't like you or that you burden them, things like that. And so I was always existing in that realm. And I think life keeps providing us with this weirdly perfect synchronous opportunity to hear from the outside world the very voices that we are still carrying on the inside world that have been haunting us, that are no longer or maybe never were true, and that are being invited to heal. So I feel like they perfectly captured my inner voice. I mean, And besides in San Francisco grad school, like who says that? You're taking up too much space. Like it's just not even it's like a funny language, but I'm like, oh my God, they're literally saying my worst nightmare to me.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to literally do the opposite, which let me know a few things. One is people see a lot more about you than you think. Two is that life is a wonderful mirror inviting you to heal as long as you recognize that those voices aren't true. And then three was, oh gosh, the most important one of all, I forgot.
It'll come
then
back.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It'll come back.
It'll come back.
But I learned a lot in that experience of just sitting there thinking, oh gosh, you think you're hiding things. You think you're managing things. You think you can control things. This is just the whole way the ego operates. Like, I've got this on lock. I just won't be too big, but I won't be too small. I won't talk here because here people will say something if you talk, and I've got it all on lock, and I'm going to keep Vanessa not just safe, but people are going to love her and she's going to be happy. And then it's like against your best ego attempts, exactly what you're afraid of gets invited into your life anyway.
I'm, as you're speaking, flashing back to like college years, high school years, because mine was like cram myself down into the smallest energetic space possible so I'm not seen, so I'm not too much, which too much was like existing at all. And so what that did, of course, was like it created tremendous physical and energetic and emotional tension. So I wound up with all these health problems. I had chronic pain through my whole body, couldn't open my jaw. I became kind of high maintenance because I needed to attend to my body that because it was trying so hard to cram itself into a tiny little container that no one would notice or be threatened by or offended by.
And that would have no needs.
That would have no needs. Like if I just become a little moon rock. And then, of course, it's like imploding, and I'm now I have to deal with it. Got to the point that it was so bad, I couldn't open my mouth. I couldn't get out of bed some days because I couldn't put weight on my right leg. Like it was no longer an opportunity to ignore, I have needs. So it happened in this volcanic eruption kind of way of health needs from spending so much time trying to condense myself into not existing and being invisible.
Totally. There's a saying in Chinese medicine theory, extreme yin turns to yang and extreme yang turns to yin. So it's a wonderful illustration of how against our ego's best attempts to keep us safe, these things don't work. Because I think what I did was the opposite. You and I have a similar, let's say, fear process. Like, don't be seen too much. Don't be too much of a burden, not too much need. Don't take up too much space. Because really, I'm a piece of shit, though. So I don't even earn the right to breathe. Like the whole weird spectrum. Only you got extra tight and compacted, and I got extra diffuse and lax.
Yep.
Like I have no core muscles and no pelvic floor. I barely can like pull my whole body together to stand in front of you. And I'm going to get really diffuse in the space. But it's the same thing. It's just I'm not going to stand in my body and exist fully because that is where I'm most experienced and most seen and I exist the most, right? But you have these like funny moments where these patterns are being engaged and inevitably extreme yin turns to yang. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what would happen to me. Let's say in my first marriage, you're like, I'm going to try to be really cool. I'm going to try to have no needs. I'm going to try to be like easy breezy, the best wife in the world. And then the next thing I know, since I found that most humans are terrible martyrs, like a month later, I'm like wailing and crying and yelling at him over something and being the most difficult kind of person to sit with.
Because ultimately need arises because you are a person.
Yeah, because it hurts. It hurts to be in whatever that irregular pattern is, whatever that shape is you've been trying to assume innocently in order to stay okay. It hurts. So you attempt to be this character, this role, this agenda that you think will create safety, and it looks a certain way, and inevitably that cracks and something else comes pouring through, which we could say, thank God for.
Right.
Because
that we don't succeed at our terrible strategies for avoiding life and being nobody. Oh.
Yes. Wouldn't it be unfortunate if I spent the rest of my life trying not to shine? Wouldn't that be unfortunate? Because of course we all shine. We are all radiant beings as soon as we inhabit the space of our own existence and let the light shine through. We are all that. So wouldn't it be unfortunate if I succeeded, if I did too good a job and it never showed any deficiencies in the plan so that I had to find a new way of relating, right? So I guess thank God. But the other part that helps is, it gives us, I guess, some sort of insight is how I would phrase it. So for example, as I was tracking it from an intellectual level, I'm like, okay, Vanessa, you're trying to be like this best wife in the world. You're trying to be cool. You don't want to have needs. You don't want to be a burden. But once every 6 to 8 weeks, you're literally like decomposing in front of this person and wailing. And it takes hours for you to pull this through, right? And like find some place of relief. That doesn't seem like it's working according to plan. We need to be looking at a new way of existing because unfortunately I was afraid I was too much. And in those moments where it all built up and I was like literally disintegrating and crying and like pleading with a person, I mean, I've done all sorts of unfortunate machinations that I can only look back at with compassion. But in those moments, guess what? I was too much for him because it's often too much for someone to sit with the depth and breadth of their unmet, unmetabolized pain, especially when it's being directed at them, especially when the need is being projected onto them. So you're literally like taking all the energy in your body and like casting it onto them. Like you have the power and only you to tell me I'm okay. You have the power and only you to tell me I'm lovable, right? So I'm casting all of my power onto them, all of the responsibility for my okayness onto them, all of this unmet, unmetabolized intergenerational pain that I didn't know how to sit with onto them. And I'm looking at them like, now do something with this so I can feel okay. And guess what? It was too much. And then there goes the voice in my head. Here's my worst case scenario coming to pass. And it says, I am too much for people. Only, of course, as all of us sitting here having this conversation can see that younger Vanessa couldn't see was, it's not capital I am too much. I am fine. I am whole. I am precious. I am one. I am complete. It was the habits and patterns of my ego protective mechanism combined with this pain I didn't know how to sit with. I didn't even know I had to sit with it. I didn't know how to meet it and I didn't know I had to meet it. It was all of that was getting projected onto this person, all of the power I was giving them that was too much, but not me. But isn't that easy to get confused?
Yeah. But such a helpful discernment, right? Because all of us, we've all been through things like this. And so we can see there are places, the takeaway isn't going to be, you're amazing, shine in the glory of your beingness. Anyone who feels like you're too much is always 100% wrong. Like it would be so tidy and great to say that and make a great Instagram meme, but we have to discern, right? Sometimes the volcanic eruption of the ego strategy gone awry or gone haywire, it's too much. But if we can see it, if we can have that spaciousness that it's not my existence is too much, it's actually my strategies to avoid evade, contort my existence in the hopes that I will be the robotic version that I assume everyone will love unconditionally, that pressure internally, when it explodes and when it's projected, because of course, if that's the belief system, all of the power, as you were pointing out, is in the other's hands. You need to deliver to me. My ability to know that I have a right to exist is a little bit of a tall order. That is right. Definitely under the header of inside job. To know inside out, I, as I am, have a right to exist. And what does that mean? You know, that's the whole journey that we're up to here, talking about that. But if we can get a little spaciousness and be like, oh, that was an eruption as a part of a strategy to not exist that then got projected outwards, turns out that is a little bit too much for people. Like in my health experience, it was a lot. I think I was seeing doctors 3 days a week. I was commuting from Providence to Boston to see my team of doctors. It was like a shit show for an entire year. I wasn't super connected to my college friends at that. I wasn't a normal college kid. I was the sick one again, just like I had grown up as, who had to commute to her important doctor team. That's a lot. Obviously, the regular old college people who didn't know what it felt like to be in a body that felt like it was a unhealthy 80-year-old were kind of like, I wasn't the person they were going to call for like, let's grab a pizza. It was like, where is she? I don't know. Is she at the hospital again? I don't know. That's too much. But it was because I had to repair the rupture with myself. Not because anyone who's listening, especially, right? Not because if you're ill, you're too much. Not because if you have needs, you're too much. But because it was a part of a fundamental misalignment and contortion where I was sitting on myself. And that needed to explode because, like, let's take a beat and acknowledge that these are one of the moments where we can see that life is woven of love. Doesn't mean it always feels good and that it's not sometimes hell, but that it doesn't let us get away with our strategies of self-annihilation. Ultimately, at a certain point, it's going to just be like, nope, and push it to the point where it's spewing and it's obvious. There was a contortion here. I missed something in innocence and unconsciously, but now it's all here. So I have to start the work, right? Of what is coming up to the surface. How did I compress myself or disappear myself in whatever way that presented?
When we're too much for people, there's a few different things that could be happening. Let's say we began the conversation with our shininess or our thriving may feel threatening to someone who has a painful pattern of lack, a painful pattern of there's not enough to go around, or a painful pattern of I'll never get it. I'll never get to be happy and thrive, right? So sometimes when we're told we're too much, we're experienced as too much, too shiny, too bright, it is because it's triggering some painful thing within the person who is in the seat of the beholder, right? Sometimes when we look at too much, like what we're talking about just now, Brooke, we can look at it as their nervous system is getting overloaded, right? So if we have a ton of pain or a ton of anger or a ton of anxiety that's running through the circuitry of our body and our energy field, there might be some people who it overloads their nervous system, and then they go into their defensive strategies. They shut down, they withdraw, they try to fix, they try to distract, right? They go into their defensive strategies, and it's very innocent. It could be just in that moment where someone's pain overwhelms them and they experience that person as just too much. It can be always. I think we can see this in the quintessential father figure. And sorry, men, because everyone listening, all of you men are very sensitive. But if we look at like the stereotypical patriarchal vision of a father where the father is like trained out of having emotional depth. And then he sits with maybe his crying child, boy or girl. And he's like, there, move on. Wanna get a cookie? Right? Like, and as opposed to this like Norman Rockwell version of a mother who's like, has sensitivity, which PS, that's unfortunately untrue as well. But, so if someone doesn't have the depth and breadth of contact with their deep self, they can't have contact with your deep self, and you can overload their nervous system. But the way that we take that, the way that we interpret that is so interesting. And I say it because I'm thinking of a moment with my mother, and like, bless her heart. I'm so glad I can see this for what it is now, because I was a teenager. I was hormonal. I was moody. I was prone to fits of happiness complemented with deep depression and self-hatred. And so I must have been melting down, crying, and who knows what I was pointing to. I don't know. And my mother said something to me like, oh, hun, it's too much. Maybe you have to go on the birth control pill. And I spent years in therapy pointing to that moment as proof that I was too much and I wasn't welcome and my feelings weren't welcome. And, you know, when I started to wake up out of that and look back in retrospect, you know, as a woman who's I'm probably at least my mom's age now, and I'm like, oh my God, that must have been a lot for her. I mean, she has a nervous system that's prone to anxiety. She has a big trauma history. She doesn't know, no one ever meets her emotions with that much solidity and presence and love. So she has no experience in this. And I'm a teenager just melting down with a ton of pain, granted some of it from my childhood. But I can imagine she was overloaded. But that didn't mean she didn't want me to shine. She didn't want me to exist. She didn't want me to be present. It was like a moment in time. But the way that my protective personality went was it stored that as important, meaningful information that says my emotions aren't welcome. I'm not welcome. No one has space for me. Clearly I'm a burden and I'm too much. And I'm like, oh my God, if my mom ever knew that moment led to that whole personality structure, which it never is just that moment alone. It's a collection of those moments, of course, but she would be shocked.
Yeah. It would be funny and bizarre, right? To hear how the ego interpreted it and took it in and cultivated it into a story.
I mean, I'm not a parent, but I just get the sense that kids oftentimes are a lot for parents, moment to moment.
Yeah. And yeah, there's a relief. We're not going to have the parenting conversation, but in just being like, I'm going to fuck up my kid, not on purpose, but because there will be some moment where their little ego structure goes, oh, today she lost her shit. And that means I'm too much. And like, it'll hold on to that for, I don't know how long, 20 years. I mean, it's a real exercise in like, I am not in control of how this ego structure interprets what's happening. And I'm a person who's not doing this perfectly, because perfect isn't a real thing, especially with parenting. But, you know, the remedy, not to use a heavy-handed word, but the remedy for what we're talking about is the path of coming home to ourselves and feeling like we can exist as we actually are, which is great news because I can cover that in the next 5 minutes, how to do that. Just kidding. So it's a process. It's an ongoing process. But the good news is when we do come home to ourselves, when we do start presenting more and more as we actually are and not through contortions about how we feel like we need to present in the world in order to not be too much or not be too little, that it's healing, obviously, for the self, but it's healing for others as well. So a few different things can happen as we'd like to circle back to the beginning of the conversation in the word thrive. As we thrive more, and I'm using that word to mean we take up space exactly as who we are. And in any given moment, whatever is in alignment or true in that particular moment, we can hear it, we can acknowledge it, we can live from that. And we're meeting the other people in our life from that place more and more frequently. It's not like we stick the landing and we do it perfectly forever, but more and more frequently. In some cases, some people will leave. Some people will find that unsettling to them and to where they are at in their process. And there will be certain people who start behaving differently around us as we start to take up the fullness of who we actually are. For some, it will be off-putting because they wanted us to keep playing the role that didn't trigger them or just what they expected from us. So as we come into our realness, there is a truth that some people will go away. But it's healing for them, even if you never see this person again, because they contacted something real, which is healing for all of us. They contacted someone coming into their truth, and that's a seed that's planted for them too. And then in other situations, other relationships, it will be such a relief for people, and your intimacy with them and your love with them will really deepen no matter who they are, because we are energy beings. People can feel when you're contorting yourself. People can feel when you're in them scanning and trying to match their needs and provide something to them and wear a certain Halloween costume. And when that goes away, or when it becomes more subtle and less frequent, for a lot of people, it's a huge relief. It's like, you're just you. I don't need to manage you or make you feel like you're doing the thing for me that makes me feel like you feel. It's just all that confusion and convolutedness goes away. And it's just the basicness of life. We're at dinner and we're talking about what we're actually doing, what our day actually was, how we're actually feeling. We're not trying to create an experience for other people. So, I just feel like it's important to say that, because when we come into the fullness of who we are, the life out there does shift. Our relationship patterns do shift, and good to know. And that it is healing for the self and for the world and for others from the larger perspective. Ultimately.
I would love to add to that, though, that they may not shift as much as you think. Because recently I had a client who was very afraid of going through their, journey and awakening and embodying, because the way people speak about it, all spiritual teachers give that caveat. Things will change, things will go. And because you're talking to a protective personality about that, the protective personality goes, well, I don't know what you're saying. And that just sounds really scary and bad. And I just noticed for myself, and I'm not at some, finish line and destination, but as I've become more embodied, more myself, more spontaneous, less concerned about too much and too little, things have changed, but actually fairly minorly in terms of the look of my life. If anything, they've just gotten better.
Yeah.
And so there was a couple of people that fell away, but they weren't significant players in my life. It was just some acquaintances, and mostly things just shifted. And so I just want people to also know not to anticipate this too much, things changing, because if they do, at that moment, you're usually feeling much better about that.
Yeah, it's very different than from the moment of, I need to deliver a certain experience in order to exist.
Yeah. The anticipation of, oh my God, I may lose my lover if I become myself, for example, can be a lot scarier. But if that were to come to pass, that your primary relationship would change, it would be feeling more aligned for that to change. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't be as scary. It's almost like I saw a hilarious line on the show Broad City. Have you ever seen the show Broad City?
Just little bits. It's on my mind lately. I'm like, next binge item. Got to go for that one.
It's super raunchy and hilarious. The last couple of seasons less funny. But there's this funny exchange between them where they're trying to figure out something with their day. Like, how are we going to get this couch back to my house? And one of them says, you know what? That's a problem for future us. And the other one says, I'm sure they'll figure it out. I was just like, yes. If only we could just say, should relationships fall apart? Like, that'll be a problem for future us. I don't have to worry about it right now.
It's so perfect. That's actually a great mantra.
Oh, it was great. I said to Mario, I'm like, please remember that and use that with me anytime I'm in an anxious spiral. Because, you know, even thinking about what will life be as I step into my wholeness and as I shine brighter, it's like, well, that's a problem for shinier self. Mm-hmm. And shinier self is going to have new tools and new perspectives with which to meet that circumstance, thereby not even making it the problem you think it will be. Mm-hmm. So that's a wonderful bit of information. And the other thing is, in terms of solving this in 5 minutes, as you said, Brooke,
Let's make
I'm
sure
going to now wrap it up in 30 seconds.
Awesome.
And you've heard this from us before, most likely, unless you're new tuning in. I think so far to date, Judith Blackstone's realization process is one of the more helpful things in the conversation of too much. For example, the way that she helps you learn to access the core of your body so you can sit back in yourself, it automatically gives people more space in the room. And so it gives more space for relationality. Mm-hmm. And it helps you learn that you're safe to get out of that compressed little box that you described earlier, Brooke, or to pull back in from the patterns of diffusion. Because ultimately, we talk about safety a lot, right? And sometimes it feels like a dramatic word to me every once in a while when I use it. But I still think it's the best word, because ultimately it's when we are in our ego protective strategy, the implication is I can't just trust that everything is okay right now. Mm-hmm. I have to take care of things. I have to manage things. Ipso facto, I'm not really safe to just let go of my guards and my strategies and my plotting and be here. Mm-hmm. Not really safe to just exist spontaneously. So safety is kind of the best word I can come up with so far. But if you're curious, like I have that, and you're identifying, that might be a way for you to go. You can look up Judith Blackstone's realization process techniques, and she has an audio program on Sounds True, and see if those meditations speak to you. It was certainly a way that I think really helped me.
Yeah, I'm actually heading from here to go teach the third part of a class in realization process about relationality, specifically for helpers who overgive. And it's the third in a 3-part class, and it's just been really beautiful to watch that work. It's so, her embodiment work is just so, I was going to say tangible, but of course it seems a little obscure at first. But when you start to have the experience of where you're locating and where you're relating from, suddenly you feel like you have a lot of choice, and your interactions just show up differently. You know, you notice the other person differently. There's more easy access to things like affection. There's a lot of roominess for them to be who they are while you're being who you are. And none of it is fabricated, like, you should nod and smile, the kinds of stuff we would be conditioned to do. When you figure out that you can actually play with where you're locating in your body and in space, it really changes things profoundly. I love that work for that.
We're so glad to have you as part of our community and that you listened to today's show. Any notes that we said in the show, including resources, live on the website at blissandgrit.com. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. This is where you can go donate to the show and also get a few rewards for your support. You can come hang with us and chat with us on Instagram and Facebook, or subscribe on the website, again, blissandgrit.com, if you want to get our mailing of weekly resources that we're currently loving, or stay in the loop for any events we may have coming in the future. We're so grateful for the reviews that all of you have written, for the membership support that so many of you are providing, and for all the notes that you send. I just want to read a little review from Anna McClourdy. She left this on our Facebook page. Hi, Anna. She says, absolutely obsessed, a must listen for anyone interested in the path of growth. In-depth yet lighthearted and accessible conversations on spirituality, relationships, and mental health. My new favorite podcast. We love that, Anna, and we love all of you. Thank you all so much. Till next week.